today we wrap up our 7-week fall series. Kind of hard to believe that 7 weeks has gone by so quickly. We've been working with this book up here called Spiritual Economics by Eric Butterworth, and today we're going to look at a chapter called The Money Enigma. And money is kind of an enigma, isn't it? Anyone remember a time when it was considered to be impolite to talk about money? Along with politics and religion and other things. Well, money was one of the things you weren't supposed to talk about in polite company. Perfectly okay in impolite company, I guess, which is what things often turn into, but that's what I always heard. Don't talk about money in polite company. Now it's gone to the totally opposite extreme. People talk about money all the time, which is just as unhealthy as never talking about it. So wouldn't it be nice if we could stake out some middle ground there, some middle ground between avoidance and obsession? Well, Eric has an interesting approach to this problem. He says that we need to take a positive approach to the way that we think and talk about money. And he starts out with this rather bold affirmation. He says, money is good. Money is God in action. That's one way of looking at it because it is a symbol. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Money is just a symbol. How long has it been drummed into our heads that money is the root of all evil? Money can't buy happiness. Things like that. Like an attempt to create a negative connection with the word money. And actually, money is not the root of all evil. That's a misquote. Comes from Paul's letter to Timothy, which, by the way, was a forgery. Paul's letter to Timothy was a forgery. And what it really says is that the love of money is the root of all evil. So money's not the problem, greed is. Money isn't the problem, it's the love of money to the exclusion of anything else, including the needs of human beings. You know, it seems like for the longest time now, the collective consciousness of this country and really the world has been centered in greed and, of course, the fear that breeds greed. And that, in and of itself, that state of consciousness, fear and greed, is a state of poverty. It doesn't matter how wealthy the outer world looks, a collective consciousness based on fear and greed is in a state of poverty. A couple of weeks ago I shared a provocative quote that came from our co-founder in Unity, Charles Fillmore, who once said, "It is a sin to be poor." Shocked a lot of people because it sounds like that terrible blame the victim mentality that we hear so often these days. Blame the victim. What was it in your consciousness that caused this? What Charles meant by being poor is that state of consciousness that's centered in fear, in lack, and in greed. It's a sin. And when we use the word sin, what we mean is missing the mark or error thinking. We're getting it wrong. We're getting it wrong. Money doesn't cause problems, consciousness does. Take $1. Think about what you can do with $1. And a lot of us are thinking, yeah, not much these days, right? But just for the sake of argument, think of the things that you can do with $1. The same dollar can be used to make a drug deal. It can be used to buy weapons. It can be used to buy food for a hungry person, right? Money is basically neutral. We get to choose whether to give it a positive or negative charge. Money is neutral. It's simply an agreed upon means of exchange. It's an agreed upon means of exchange. So I guess that means that we should all strive to be agreeable, right? Want to make sure we're agreeing on the same things. Well, Eric wants us to get in touch with the deeper significance of money and what it stands for. Everybody needs money as a means of agreed upon exchange. We want to be able to provide for our basic needs. But so often when someone says that they need money, they really mean something else. Here's what Eric says. Have you ever had a time of financial stringency and cried out, "I need money"? It is a confusion of priorities. More importantly, you need faith. You need a flow of creativity. You need ideas. And again, we get back to that word faith, which I like to define as trusting in what we know to be true. So think about it for a moment. When we contemplate making money or earning money, do we visualize this symbol up here? Let's see if I got these in the right order. Yes. Do we visualize this symbol here, a piece of paper with some, I don't know, some white-haired guy on there? And there's always guys, right? That's going to change, I think. But with numbers and symbols and things on it, is this what we visualize when we think of money? Or do we ever think about ideas, creativity, action? What do we really want? Do we want the symbol, this hunk of paper, or do we really want what it stands for? It's a really important distinction at the level of consciousness. Here's a quote from Eric at the end of chapter 9. He says, "The teacher points to the truth. The student worships the pointer," right? That's what goes on with money. Where is our consciousness focused? What is our vision? And that's really the topic this morning. What are we looking at? What are we focusing on? Let's put the next slide up here. This is an example that I've used before. Big white triangle. Kind of like a big old blank sheet of paper, right? Lots of empty space to take in and to contemplate. Okay, so we look at that. Now we do this. Boom. Put a black dot in the middle of it. Immediately what happens? All of a sudden that blank sheet isn't so blank anymore. That little dot kind of gets our attention. Our focus is brought to the dot and we think, what's that all about? Must be important, or it wouldn't be there right in the middle of all that empty space. It's kind of like the media that reports on the very small number of plane crashes in the world, but they say nothing about how many flights arrive safely every single day. So the world encourages us to focus on the negativity in that little black dot, and then we let that shape our worldview, and that includes our worldview of money and the economy. That's why what we need is a new vision and a new perspective. Now this is an example that I've used before. It comes from a guy named Gary Moore, who founded an organization called Financial Seminary. He compares that dot in the middle of the blank page to our federal debt. Let's flip to the next one here. That dot is our national debt, which updated today, November 2015, 18.5 trillion. What they leave out is the rest of the page. All of that blank space around it. That is our total national wealth, both public and private, which is 159 trillion. We never get the rest of the story. Out of control debt isn't a good thing, but let's keep it in perspective, please. And that dot on the page, it can represent any of the things we say are challenges. Call it climate change. Call it poverty. Call it the economy. ISIS. Whatever. It's there. But when we focus exclusively on the challenge, we lose sight of our assets. We lose perspective. We lose track of the truth. We lose track of the positive things that are all around us. And the positive things can really overwhelm that dot. And they do overwhelm that dot, which seems to capture our exclusive attention. And of course, we know there are those who gain from keeping our attention focused on the black dot. And they really know how to do it well. They are masters of manipulating our emotions. And if they can manipulate our emotions, then they can exploit our fears. The other thing that they do through this process is they dehumanize us. And dehumanization is very, very dangerous. We saw that in Beirut and Paris this last week. Dehumanization. The attackers dehumanize their victims. The attackers themselves have been dehumanized in their own experience. People with empathy, people with compassion, people with truly humanistic values would not be able to do something like that. So dehumanization is very, very dangerous, and we need to keep our eyes open because it can come at us in some rather subtle and, dare I say, insidious forms. For example, the Christmas season is almost upon us. Now, what could possibly be dehumanizing about Christmas? Well, it's the way that the public spectacle gets created by our consumer culture, right? This public spectacle that turns us into mindless, voracious consumers. We are pasted with the label consumer. You are a consumer. It is your job to go out and consume. A consumer culture is inherently dehumanizing. Now think for a minute about the major spiritual theme of Christmas. It's all about humanization. It's about the divine appearing in human form, the idea of incarnation. In the Christian churches, more traditional Christian churches, Jesus is regarded as the one and only unique example in human history of the divine human. Well, in unity, we turn that upside down and we turn it inside out because we say that everyone is a part of the incarnation. The fullness of our humanity is equal to the fullness of anything that we call divine. The real power isn't in some God being out there. The real power is within each of us. That is a humanizing message. So what we need to do is to figure out a way to humanize the economy. We need to figure out a way to humanize the economy in the name of the common good. And this is, I think, something that's on people's minds these days. It's a great time to shift consciousness and shift culture. And there is such a thing as humanistic economics. It's a minority position now, a dissident position perhaps even. But, you know, times like this sometimes call for a little subversiveness and a few dissidents, people who work outside the kind of conventional thinking that got us where we are. Here's a few of the key ideas that they talk about in humanistic economics. Number one, we draw a distinction between needs and wants. They're not saying we should eliminate wants or desires, but we still have to be able to pay attention to where the basic survival needs of human beings are not being met. That's an equation that's not part of conventional economics. Conventional economics tends to focus almost exclusively on satisfying wants. Needs are irrelevant or at best secondary. Second key idea from humanistic economics tells us that the most important choices that we have to make are between lower and higher values. Does one choose competition to the exclusion of cooperation? Does one choose greed over fairness and generosity? Do we choose exploitation of the natural world or stewardship? Those are important choices. In standard economics, the only values are centered around price, or what they call cost incentive. So in that system, love is irrational. Love is irrational, but greed is perfectly logical. I think about that movie from the 80s, Wall Street. Michael Douglas tells his young protege, greed is good. How's that working for us now, huh? Which brings us to the third idea that we get from humanistic economics. The sole or exclusive pursuit of individual self-interest is not fully rational, but is itself ultimately a form of self-destructive behavior. The pursuit of individual self-interest is not fully rational. It's a form of self-destructive behavior. Spiritual principles tell us that self and other are not totally separate. We may be individual, but we're also part of an interdependent wholeness, and that's where we find our oneness. An economic system that's based on always separating self and other and focusing on the exclusive pursuit of individual self-interest will eventually consume itself. And we can see that starting to happen right now. And the solution, at least the start of a solution, is as simple as a shift in the way that we think and speak. The thing that I like about this humanistic approach is that it isn't guilt or fear-based. It isn't guilt or fear-based. And something else that I've noticed about this humanistic approach, and maybe you have too, is that it seems to capture the essence of what Jesus talked about. In his ideal vision of the world, the last would be first. The first would be last. That's what he said. Things like virtue and goodness had nothing to do with how much wealth or power you possessed. Read the Gospels and we find that the most important values are love, compassion, mercy, generosity, peacemaking, things like that. How do those things show up in our economy, in this nation? In this nation that many proclaim to be a Christian nation. It's interesting. The values of the gospel are irrational in our casino capitalist economy. So the message here is that it's time to evolve. It's time to heed the evolutionary imperative, which is change or die, right? Change or die. This is the challenge that Eric leaves us with at the end of the book Spiritual Economics, and we're going to wrap it up with this. Here's what he says. As students of new consciousness thinking, we challenge you to take hold of this prosperity principle of the omnipresence of substance. Substance is not simply spendable money, but that which gives value to everything you have, everything you do, everything you are. It is ideas, it is creativity, it is guidance, and it is health and vitality. So, for the sake of humankind as a whole, as well as for your own experience, think substance, think prosperity, think plenty for all. And I think if I had to sum it all up in one word, I'd just say think. Be aware, wake up. And one more step. Put it into action. Put it into action. Listen to the words of those who want to lead us and thereby shape our economy, and decide what direction they are pointing with those words. Spiritual evolution or just more of the same old dead end? That's ours to do. So that's it for Spiritual Economics.